Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this timely event, given the outcome of the June referendum. There's no fire drill expected. If the fire alarm does go off whilst we're in the theatre, the exit is through the double doors at the back, out onto Kensington Road, and round to the Royal Albert Hall. There'll be staff on hand to show you the way. My name is Edward Maltby, and I chair the Sibthorpe Trust. And it's been my privilege also to chair the special partnership with the British Ecological Society and the Royal Geographical Society with IBG, which has brought people, politics, and the planet, any questions, together for a second successive year. You can read the details about the three partners in your programme. Thanks to the RGS with IBG, it's perhaps fitting that we're meeting in a place where historically so many ambitious research expeditions into the then unknown were planned and reported on. Brexit is no less challenging. Last year, we tested our politicians on their agenda for the environment if elected. We are delighted that the theme this year has captured no less public as well as professional and our esteemed panel's interest in our environmental future. Just 28 days after the EU referendum, this is the first opportunity to ask some of our politicians and experts what Brexit may actually mean for our natural environment. There's a growing recognition that the environment is not just a place for nature, its wildlife and habitats, but it underpins all our lives, the sustainability and health of our economy, contributing to all aspects of human well-being, including physical and mental health, and providing the resilience to combat global threats such as climate change and food security. There's still a long way to go if we are to better link environment with other policy areas of government, and some may feel that this holds back the prioritisation of the environment in decision-making. Our links to European directives have been a strong driver of UK environmental policy and natural resource management in recent decades. How might this now change? Our management of the environment is necessarily determined by political decisions and priorities, but government's use of best available scientific evidence and other knowledge has sometimes been lacking. It is now your chance to question members of the panel on how they see the future of our environment in a post-Brexit world. We hope by the end of the evening we shall have a clearer vision of some of the serious challenges ahead and how we might best respond to them, not least where there might be new opportunities beneficial for the environment, especially through stronger public engagement and partnerships. People can contribute to the debate on Twitter using the hashtag PPPNEQs. But to help us further, I have great pleasure in introducing Jonathan Dimbleby to keep us and our panel well focused.
Thanks very much. I was reflecting before coming here, we've been through this Brexit campaign, which was, to put it mildly, bruising, sometimes brutal, in which distortions, half-truths, outright lies combined to create a very uncomfortable context for such a major decision that was being made. And I was also thinking, actually during the time, because I've been interested in this, which is why I'm here this evening, in this whole area for a very long time. Not only was this the first time, the most seismic decision that this country has taken essentially since the Second World War, but also how it is that even more important than the decision that was made in the long term, the short-term impact of Brexit, the medium-term impact of Brexit is up for debate. The long-term impact of the environment on biodiversity, climate change, of the decisions that we do or don't make in the short, medium, and long term far transcend whether you believe there is merit or demerit in the Brexit decision itself. But it does make the questions that arise out of the decision that you, most of you, I guess, one way or another, participated in, extremely pertinent. The focus, the way in which we're going to do this is I'm going to invite, through a question, each panelist to speak for no more than a minute. I shall ruthlessly cut them off if they go beyond their 60 seconds worth of distance run. And then we've pre-selected a lot of questions that came in, and from them we will get through not all of them, but we will get through a significant number, particularly as I know our panelists will be gracious enough to know that you will want to comment on what you hear. And I'm going to come back in the form of any questions, and all of you listen to any questions every week. There is another television program from time to time which is not dissimilar, which I imagine you kind of catch occasionally, which has a similar format, the baby of the grown-up radio program. And I don't mean that. I love him dearly, and it's a great program. So if you come in, when you come in, don't give long speeches. Make a comment, make a question. You can direct it or have it general. It's as you like. And we've also, this is being streamed, and we have got one or two questions have already come in that have been tweeted in. So let's kick off. Oh, I should kick off with the panel is sitting in no other. I'm on the right here simply because I can see all the panel. You should draw no political conclusions from it, any more than you should from the fact that next door to me is the MEP Stuart Agnew, who speaks on agriculture for UKIP. It's alphabetical order for them. Natalie Bennett, the leader of the Green Party. George Eustice, who's Minister of State for Farming, Food and the Marine Environment. Next door to him, Kerry McCarthy, who until just before the vote of confidence resigned from the shadow team, and she was, until that moment, Shadow Minister for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Martin Nesbitt, who's Senior Fellow at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. And at the end, Kate Parmenter, Baroness Parmenter as she formerly is, who speaks on the environment for the Lib Dems. So let's go in. My first question is for better, for worse, what are the challenges, risks, opportunities presented by the Brexit vote? Would you start on that? Let's start there with Natalie Bennett.
Okay, well, I was just looking down at my handbag, which has still got a very sad relic. It was the Green Party Remain campaign sticker that said greener in. So we were campaigning very strongly for a Remain vote. We believe there are many joint problems we need to face together. However, professionally, I'm an optimist. I'm the Green Party leader, I've got to be an optimist. And so I think what we have to do is start from where we are now and acknowledge that Brexit has given us a new government. Now, one could say many things about people like Andrea Leadsom, but I'm going to focus on the fact that we have a Chancellor who is at least on the record as acknowledging that climate change is a serious threat to us all. And we have a Business and Energy Secretary who has something of a track record on energy. And we have an opportunity because we're now so clearly in a state of crisis, economic, social, environmental crisis, political crisis, that everything has to change. And that's what we need. We need to change everything, our economic structures, our social structures, our treatment of the environment. They have to change, and now is the opportunity.
Thank you. You absolutely obeyed the rule to within 2 seconds. See if you can do as well. Stuart Agnew.
I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be trying to persuade everybody that we are not going to change the world's weather. So that's, I hope, got everybody stirred up. A lot of the legislation that we've had on this subject of changing the world's weather and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide is rather driven by the EU. I'm rather encouraged by the fact that there is no longer a DECC. I was pleasantly surprised at that, and I think that will give us the opportunity to completely relook at our energy use. I think we may well see a reduction in the number of wind turbines been going up, which in themselves do kill a lot of birds and have a huge impact on the landscape. I'd love to see them decommissioned. The same with the AD plants, where 1,400 acres of maize is grown for something. Do you want me to stop? I think that has a negative impact on our environment. I'd rather see food grown there. I think we're going to see a bigger buzz around fishing ports as we suddenly get our fishing industry back, and that may well have some impact on the local environment.
Thank you. And George Eustice.
Well, the first thing I'd say is this was a really big decision. And in life, big decisions sometimes make people feel apprehensive. But what I'm detecting in DEFRA among our officials now is a real excitement and enthusiasm for the opportunities this creates. Firstly, it creates a whole space where we can have genuine policy innovation in the environment. We can pilot new ideas. And officials at the moment who fret about whether we're obeying this or that EU diktat will instead be able to go back to first principles and work out how best to deliver for our environment. Secondly, the UK will be back on the world stage. Things like CITES, the conventions, wildlife conventions around the world, we will regain our own seat, regain our own voting rights, regain our own voice. And that'll give us a stronger position to argue for the world environment. And finally, it gives us the opportunity to really reshape things like the Common Agricultural Policy so that we actually pay farmers for ecosystem services so that we can really deliver for habitats, for soils, for water quality.
Thank you. Kerry McCarthy.
Okay, I suppose my starting point is I think it was very disappointing that the environment wasn't discussed more during the referendum campaign. It was obviously discussed amongst NGOs. I was on the steering group of Environmentalists for Europe. We tried to get the message out there, but it wasn't a factor in the way that I think it should have been, because potentially we could lose a lot of very important, not just environmental regulations, but also things like food safety standards, animal welfare laws, things like the laws on air pollution, water quality. So all that is in the balance now, and part of it depends on what model we go for post-Brexit, or how long the Brexit negotiations take and what comes up in the mix then. The key things I would point to, I do think with the coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy, there is potential to look at land management, how we use those subsidies to ideally reward good environmental practice. But we do have a government that for a start, I'd say has been very much enthralled to the NFU, and there's a question about whether we will then just go back to subsidising production and compensating for the market failures within farming rather than environmental goods. And this sort of hatred of regulation and red tape, which I would describe as environmental protections, there's this ideological discussion to be had about whether you could trust the British government to do that.
From your perspective, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, Martin Nesbitt.
Yeah, I'm still puzzled as to what I'm doing on the panel, but I think I'm posing as a sort of neutral expert, which is a tricky position for anyone who, like me, spent 25 years as a civil servant.
You having to work very hard at it?
No, indeed. So I've spent 2.5 years trying to be an independent expert, working at the IEP. In terms of risks and opportunities, we've put a couple of research reports on our website in advance of the referendum, and broadly the analysis we set out there is that by and large, the EU has been a very positive force for UK environmental issues, and by and large, an exit vote poses significantly greater risks for the environment than a Remain vote. But we are where we are, and like Natalie, it's a question now of making that situation a success. So, just to put my cognitive biases out into the open, I did vote Remain and see significant downsides to being outside. One of the issues I think we need to focus on is that once you launch the Article 50 process, there's then the risk of reaching a slightly unplanned, unnegotiated exit where the UK is effectively dumped out of the EU. And how do we ensure that there is proper contingency planning for that? And I'm hoping that the current administration has a better approach to contingency planning than its predecessor.
Kate Parmenter.
Well, as a Lib Dem, I obviously campaigned as a pro-European, but as an environmentalist, again, I see there are major threats for us in the position we now face ourselves in. George said the opportunities for protecting our environment. I would question the use of the term our environment, because if we look at the water resources, at the air we share with the rest of Europe and our migratory species, the question marks over where our environment ends and the rest of Europe ends is a question about how we are going to create a new means of protecting those resources. And secondly, I'm concerned because I believe our position, particularly on issues like climate change, which are global issues, I mean, where are we going to end up? We're no longer part of an important EU bloc, which was so important in the lead up to Paris. I mean, who are we going to join up with in these global forums? But as a Liberal Democrat, I always try to be, like Natalie, a bit optimistic. And maybe the one thing that we can look to is a really big debate, as Kerry was saying, about where money goes that has previously been coming to us in the CAP, £3 billion a year going to our farmers. If that sort of level of subsidy is going to continue, we need a public debate about the goods that farmers are providing. And that might mean that by following the money issue, we actually get a really genuine public debate about what we want our land to do and what we want protected.
Thank you very much. And thanks to start off with. You've been so succinct, all 6 of you, an absolute example to your peers. We'll go into our first question, which comes from Andy Lester, who asks, is Andy Lester here or not? Yeah, the microphone to Andy Lester, please. The same question as you put, if you would.
Sure. Questions addressed initially to George Eustace.
Given the recent... to everyone. Questions go to everyone.
Right. Given the recent EU vote, what impact will Brexit have on key legislation protecting our wildlife, specifically such as the Birds and Habitats directives?
George Eustace.
The first thing to bear in mind is that we will remain signatories to the Berne Convention, which is a Council of Europe convention, nothing to do with the EU, which the UK signed in the 1970s. And actually, the Birds and Habitats Directive is the EU's interpretation of what implementing Berne means. And so the short answer is the types of protections that deliver our international commitments under things like the Berne Convention would stay. The likelihood is actually that a lot of the national legislation that we have that's been inspired by those 2 directives you mentioned in the short term would probably be converted onto a national legal base because that's the simplest thing to do. It'd be a huge undertaking to review all of that within just a couple of years. But then over time, we'll be able to refine, improve it, change it where it's not working. And there are lots of ways, I'm afraid, where these directives have unintended consequences. They tend to be overly litigious, overly bureaucratic, and also very inflexible. So if you're locked into something that doesn't work, you can't get out of it. It's a bit like a lobster pot, easy to get into but hard to change.
So in sum, the directive in itself you have no objection to. You just think that you can develop it more effectively outside rather than inside.
That's right. I mean, and the directive itself, what I'm saying is you would remove the directives, but you would retain your commitments under international conventions such as the Berne Convention, which is a key one. And then we would have, over a period of time, the ability to change the way we do things.
Kerry McCarthy.
Well, ideally, I'd like to believe what George is saying, that we want to retain the same levels of protection and do it under national law that we've done within the European Union. But as I said in my introductory remarks, the suspicion is that you've got a government that talks incessantly about bonfire of the Quangos, red tape, burdens on business. We had George Osborne said that the directives were a burden on business, and then the government commissioned a study which actually found out they weren't. I think George said things during the campaign about scrapping the directives, although he did then tell me that he was slightly misquoted. So that would be my concern, is yes, in theory, we could do it all ourselves. We could even do a new improved version of that, but I'm just not sure there's the political will there to do that.
Martin Nesbitt, looking at it from that detached standpoint that you outlined, how do you think that it could or couldn't have? You have 2 competing anxiety, confidence, as it were, but from the 2 politicians.
Yeah, I'm going to try quite hard to pretend not to pretend to be completely detached on this.
You're yourself here.
I mean, George mentioned the Berne Convention, which is true. You know, it underpins the commitments that the UK and the EU have made, but it also underpins the commitments that people like Russia and Kazakhstan have made. And my guess would be that we don't want a level of nature protection which is based on that level of commitment and process. So the Berne Convention essentially contains some high-sounding principles, but doesn't provide the process and the definitions which really drive the protection of nature in the UK.
So are you saying it could be stronger, as George claims it would be, but it could also be an awful lot weaker?
We could, yeah. I mean, and also there is a risk in a lot of this that it's very easy for ministers and civil servants to say, of course, the objectives will be exactly the same as they were previously. Quite often the process matters a lot in terms of protection of sites. There are certainly improvements that can be made to the process, but the UK's record on nature protection is that although we have, we've always been willing to follow what we think is the letter of the legislation, in practice it's turned out that we haven't been as ambitious as the ECJ has then told us to be. So, for example, we wouldn't have designated marine sites had the UK been left to its own devices. We've been generally pushed towards designation of more sites than government would otherwise have found it convenient to do.
Just on that one point, take the marine thing, it is the case, is it not, historically, that the EU did the pushing, whether you like the directives or whether you like the fact that it was the EU doing the pushing, the consequence of the marine sites being protected, the drive was from the EU?
Initially, so you've got several types of marine protected. There's the SACs, which is Habitats Directive. Some of them are designated. There's the SPAs, which is Birds Directive. But you then got national ones, triple SIs, for instance, and the Marine Conservation Zones, which is our main tool that we use now to protect the marine environment. I mean, the point I'd make to Martin is I get officials who've remained in the department, and Martin used to be in the department, but the problem I get is submissions that run to hundreds of pages often where we are being forced to do stuff or produce strategies under some directive or other. And when I ask them, look, what are we actually trying to achieve here? They say, well, what we're trying to achieve is just to do what we're doing anyway, but this is just a legal requirement. And you think this is ludicrous, and it prevents creative thinking. It prevents us from trying new things, because once you're in, you're stuck.
Kate?
Well, if I can just pick up Martin's point about the Berne Convention, there was one environmental group, and I'm sorry I can't remember which, but when the government started its free shooting of badgers, was going to look to use the Berne Convention to stop them doing that. It wasn't strong enough to enable to stop that. So, let's not think that there's other pieces of legislation out there which are going to help us. The Birds and Habitats Directive is a good one to pick up, because if we stay in the single market, there are other pieces of environmental legislation which will still apply. But if we do choose to stay in the single market, those are two of the key ones which will not apply. And although they're not perfect, I think everyone in this room would say they're not perfect, over the years, they have delivered in terms of protecting our birds, our migratory species. 85% of our birds are migratory, so they don't just stop at Dover. And in terms of biodiversity, what the Habitats Directive has delivered in terms of triple SIs is, to my mind, unquantifiable when we look at the threats from the development and planning and housing needs that we're going to have in the future. So I think it's a good choice to have picked up on them. They are the ones that we should most worry about. And I would argue that, of course, we should tweak them, but at the moment, we should absolutely be keeping them in transposing them into UK legislation.
Stuart Agnew.
Well, there is an assumption that only the EU can do good things, and people say, well, we've got this came from the EU. What they forget is that we handed over the competence on certain things, in the case of the environment in the mid-80s, and so we couldn't initiate these things ourselves. As far as environmental legislation goes in the Birds and Habitats Directive, I doubt there's anyone in the country who seriously contests the need or the desire to have that sort of legislation. When I went to college, it was all about production. But later, students at agricultural colleges, I am a farmer, started to learn more about the environment, and they are very keen on it as farmers and farm managers. I don't think there's any threat here at all. Secondly...
Speaking myself as a previous agricultural student and farmer, I would say there was a diversity of views, and some farmers couldn't give a monkey's about what you've just said. They simply want to... Others care so much they're prepared to operate without any profit.
I do dispute that they don't give a monkey's. I meet an awful lot. I was on the NFU Council for 9 years, and there was real thought went into it. There was real interest in it. I remember going to a conference 10 years ago called Feeding the Birds. It was absolutely packed out with farmers. There is an interest out there to do the right thing. And the second point I want to make is that we're not going to be a lawless state when we leave the European Union. There's legislation there, such as this, which is generally beneficial and desirable, but we could tweak it, as George was saying, more to our own British conditions.
Thank you. Natalie Bennett.
Well, I think Martin really sort of was getting to the heart of this, is that what you have when we're part of the EU, Birds and Habitats Directive, etc., is there's a foundation of standards. There's a referee you can go to when things aren't being obeyed. And I was just thinking of one concrete example that I've been heavily involved in recently. Above Hebden Bridge, there's a grouse moor that there's been a great deal of controversy over its management. And indeed, we saw complaints being taken to Europe that the British government was failing to enforce the rules there. Now, I very strongly believe that we should ban driven grouse shooting altogether, and I'm leading on a campaign, pushing a campaign on that, and I'd encourage everyone to get involved in that. But the point is, in terms of the management there was a referee, but if the government is just the British government and that's the final authority,
so I don't quite get that. Given that this is a very divisive issue, the grouse moor question for all sorts of reasons, why can't you both campaign for that, continue to campaign for that, and it's solved in what we like to call the mother of parliament? So why do you need the EU to resolve it?
Well, no, I mean, it's a good example because you can both ban driven grouse shooting. We were campaigning for that as a member of the EU. We will continue to campaign for that with the assumption that Brexit is on the horizon. But in the meantime, the management of that grouse moor, the complaint was this is being managed so badly that Britain isn't living up to its obligations under EU rules. So then there's somewhere to take it. You take away the EU, the government is the final arbiter, and then you're left with very difficult, no real place to go.
But you do get new checks and balances, and chief among those is Parliament. I mean, I think since I was talking to a civil servant who was in government in the 70s, and he said under that Labour government in those days, the view was that environment should remain a national competence, and that the last thing you wanted was for it to go to the EU. And they saw us reflecting our international objectives in those days through other international conventions, such as the Berne Convention. That's why it was signed in the 70s. And I think we've just got to get over this idea that, in many ways, we've been infantilized as a country over the last 40 years by thinking that we just have to wait till we're told what to do by Brussels. And taking back control means we also have to take back responsibility.
So do you really think, it's a very interesting observation, that we've been infantilized because we say to ourselves, we wait till do anything until
exactly
Brussels
what happens.
tell
We
us.
wait till we're told what to do by
So you
Brussels.
mean politicians that for the last 43 years haven't had a thought in their head, they've just said, what's Brussels going to do?
That is basically, it is a factor, I'm afraid. It affects the way departments work.
Kate next, then Kerry, and then you.
I'm just amazed that you're prepared to say that, George. The fact, as part of the European Union, we have been right at the centre table with representatives on the Council of Ministers, our civil servants, and I'm sure Martin knows better than anyone, just how much European civil servants have been driving the agenda on so many issues. I mean, we are not supine. We have not been supine. And some of the regulations that we've had over the last 40 years have been because we have been driving Europe. And one of the worries is it's going to get worse.
With a reminder that we mustn't re-fight the referendum debate.
No, but George said we were supine. And that we had...
Exactly. No, I thought it was a point worth picking up, and you picked it up. I'm going to get... Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, Martin.
Okay.
Martin, sorry.
Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, in environmental policy in particular, the treaty has some very clear principles, one of which is that if member states wish to do so, they can go further than the European legislation says. By and large, the UK hasn't taken advantage of that opportunity. Obviously, that doesn't apply in single market legislation, but it does apply in the nature legislation.
Is there any example that you can cite where that the UK has taken advantage of that right to go further? Okay.
I think no. You could say that some of the SSSI designation goes beyond the strict requirements of the habitats legislation. But the government, and I'm afraid successive governments, have had a principle of no gold plating of environmental legislation, so have specifically decided that they don't want to exercise that flexibility to be more ambitious.
Okay, yes.
I just want to pick up Kate's point in terms of about Europe is us. It's not over there. And campaigning democracy, a really good example is with fisheries policy. I'll bet there's a lot of people in this room who were involved in campaigns against discards. The campaign was run, the campaign was fought, the campaign was won, and policy changed. That was democracy in action.
It was really fought and won by a very brilliant television programme and presenter, wasn't it?
Well,
domestically.
A lot of people backing them up.
I said I'd bring you in. Sorry, Stuart.
Well, much has been said. I'd just like to talk about the Pesticides Directive as how that can have a negative effect, particularly with regard to a chemical called glyphosate. Now, where we use glyphosate, we need to do very little else. Without this material, we have to cultivate, which stirs up the soil, leaves it prone to soil erosion, and of course, burns up fuel, if you're interested in carbon dioxide emissions, and that's a completely negative step. And yet it was done with saying, well, isn't this a wonderful thing to do?
Just remind your perspective on what the glyphosate directive is.
Glyphosate is what we call a total weed killer. And the EU...
Roundup, no more.
A trade name is Roundup or Gallop or Touchdown. And it came in the late 70s, and it seems to be a political hatred against it. A firm called Monsanto made a lot of money out of it, but the patent came off about 20 years ago. Everybody produces it now. It's very cheap. And for those of us farmers who operate sprayers, we see it as one of the more gentle materials. If we're going to lose it, everyone is going to lose, and particularly the environment, in my opinion.
Okay, Kate.
Kerry.
Sorry, Kerry, I'm so sorry.
I just want to go back to what George says about the UK being infantilised and therefore not being able to act on environmental issues until the EU takes the lead and gives them permission to do so, which I don't agree with at all. To give two examples, if you look at air pollution, for example, the government, it's not a case that the government couldn't act on it, the government wouldn't act on it, and it's taken action by Client Earth, taking the UK government to court under European rules to force them into action. So the rules were there, but there wasn't the political will to do that, and the European Union acted as a mechanism. If you look at something like the ban on neonicotinoids and bees, it's been the UK government that's been pushing back against it in all the discussions at EU level where they're trying to get EU agreement. It's the UK that doesn't want to do it. So it's not that we're sort of paralysed until the EU acts. In most cases, the EU is acting, and we're the ones that are even then lagging behind and refusing to go along with
Tim,
it.
I want to move on because we've got to, but just very briefly, a response on that, because it was highly controversial, the British government resisting the directive on because of on the bees issue, if I'm putting it
On the
screwed in.
neonicotinoids, look, I had 2 applications this year, and I rejected both of them because we've got a panel of experts, the expert committee on pesticides, who give us advice on these things, and they said that it didn't satisfy the conditions for emergency use.
Independent experts, absolutely 100% confident of that? Yeah,
absolutely.
There we are.
We
have it
there
from
we go. Yeah. And we follow the scientific advice on this, and look, there have been a number of studies in the last 2 years, one in Sweden, and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology are doing a piece of work at this at the moment, that have been looking at the impacts, and some of the suggestions are that it probably has not a huge impact on honeybees, but does have quite a significant impact on bumblebees. And so this is it's a serious issue that's being looked at. We'll follow the evidence. Just because we're outside the EU doesn't mean we're going to bring back neonicotinoids. We will follow the science as we always do.
Natalie, briefly, and then
I can't leave glyphosate unchallenged. WHO, probably carcinogenic, and unless you have a truly extraordinary diet, we were told that this was a non-persistent chemical. If you do a test, you will have traces of glyphosate in your urine.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Sorry, Stuart. I know you'd like to go on this. I'm going to go to the next question. If you've got points you want to raise, because there is a similarity between the questions. A lot of them sort of overlap in this respect. So if there's a point you want to raise, just let your hand up and the microphones will come to you. But we'll go first of all to our next question, which is Amy McIntosh. Amy, just back there.
What will happen to conservation projects such as the restoration of peatlands in the UK, which use important EU funding when we leave the EU?
So if you leave the EU, there is important EU funding for the restoration of peat bogs in the UK. What will happen to that if this Brexit proposal goes ahead? What do you think the reaction will be, Stuart?
Well, for every single pound that somebody receives to help preserve a peat bog, the British taxpayer had to put £2 in it to get that money back from the EU. So there's plenty of scope and flexibility to keep these things going. Again, as I said before, it isn't just the EU who has good ideas, but we are not allowed, or haven't been, able to promote our own ideas because we gave away the power. I'm not very familiar with peat bogs coming from Norfolk, but I am aware that they're well worth preserving, and I'm sure George's department will not allow peat bogs to suffer. And it's a similar answer to all these questions. Well, what about so-and-so? What about so-and-so? We're going to lose it. If it's valuable to us in this country, we won't lose it.
And just on that, £2 for £1, £2 in, £1 out was the Martin.
Yeah, I assume that what Stuart's referring to there is the effect of the rebate. which is
yeah, but that's
generally meant...
When you say in order to look after, you didn't put it as crass as this, but in order to get the money out of to get money into peat bogs, you put in £2 and then get £1 out for the peat bogs.
Generally, as European money comes into the UK...
Is that you're citing
the British taxpayer puts about £6 billion into the CAP, and the British farmers and the environment, etc., gets £3 billion back. That's how it works.
Yeah. One of the issues in UK use of European funding has been that because of the way that the rebate operates, Treasury has been very reluctant to encourage UK projects to draw down the European money because it means that the gap between how much we pay in and how much we receive is less, which means that the Treasury gets less of a rebate back, and it actually costs them a fair amount of money. I'm going to take the kind of Brexit view reluctantly on this part of the argument, which is that by and large, as the UK is a net contributor to the European budget, to the extent that we're not contributing significant sums in order to maintain access to the internal market, which will be an issue for the negotiations, there will be some funding available, and it will be available with fewer strings than the European Union attaches to it and can be spent more simply and potentially more effectively.
George, just on this specific question that Amy puts, can you undertake to maintain the resources that are presently put into and grow them if necessary, the protection of restoration of peat bogs?
Well, look, we're in the process now of designing the next agricultural policy that will replace the CAP. But what I can say is this...
Hadn't you done that when you were campaigning for Brexit? Didn't have it all in place?
I had set out a number of key ideas and themes. So I've got to get the rest of my government colleagues to buy into those now. But the point I'd make on your specific points, there's two ways that we fund this type of activity. One is that Ofwat, through the pricing policies that they have with water companies, do fund, to quite a large extent, some of these peat bog restoration schemes. There's one on Exmoor, for instance. So it's not all EU money. Some of it is funded through the water companies. Secondly, I think there's quite a strong consensus from all parties that probably the strongest element that we've had as CAP in the last couple of decades has been the agri-environment schemes, in which the UK has had a really, really good track record of designing things that work, particularly the higher level stewardship schemes, which tends to be the element of the CAP that funds that sort of work. So, and given that we've invested so much money in some of these higher level schemes, I think it's highly likely that we'll have something that continues that work so that we don't lose what we've started.
I'm going to get any hands up for questions, otherwise I'll take the next one, and then I'm sure you will want to come in. Yeah, we've got one here. You don't have to say anything other than the question.
Yeah, hello. Just relating to that last question, I think maybe it was part of that question, but one of the funding streams available for something like the peat restoration was the EU Life funding, but also funding pots like Interreg. Will those be replaced by a UK government?
Well, it's the same point. You've got to convince your colleagues and the money's got to be there. But in principle, would you advocate that that money that is presently coming via the EU should be replicated by the British government?
Yes, the short answer is yes. We know that peat restoration can have quite an important role in controlling carbon. I would say one thing, just coming back to one of the earlier points on peat. I mean, we have had some examples where the Habitats Directive has forced us to spend extraordinary amounts of money trying to bring back in peat bogs that basically have already been excavated and where the work's very hard. We spent over £25 million on the Belton Fell Moss, which is only about 200 acres. So there's a lot of deadweight costs to doing these things through the European Union and under the EU directives, and I think we'll be free to actually spend money more effectively.
As I said earlier, there are those who are watching the debate through a live web link, particularly undergraduate students on the British Ecological Society Summer School. And Ben Connor, on their behalf, you have a question. Ben, are you here? Yeah. Race around.
Thanks. This question was submitted. We've got about 60 undergraduate and secondary school students on a summer school up in Yorkshire at Malham Tarn at the moment, which has been live streamed to them. So they asked, so now that the UK has the opportunity to control more of its own environment policy, which specific policies would you change and which specific ones would you keep?
You won't have time to go through all the ones you would keep and all the ones that you would get rid of, but have a go at the key ones that you would change and the key ones you would keep, if any. Kerry McCarthy.
was hoping you wouldn't come to me first because there's just so much that you could look at. I mean, I'm not sure whether this strictly counts as environmental policy, but the circular economy package that was being debated in the EU, it's still being negotiated, but a first draft of it came forward in December, which is all about encouraging reuse, recycling, but designing in, eco-design so that you're not using as much of the planet's natural resources. So to that extent, it is an environmental policy. And we've had a woeful lack of a waste strategy from this government in recent years. And I would really like to see, if we've walked away from the EU and the negotiations there, I would really like to see us make progress on the circular economy in the UK over the coming months and years.
And what would you get, is there anything you get rid of? Liberated, as it were?
I think what George says is, in terms of some of the bureaucratic elements and the form filling, certainly if you go to any farm, you will see that a farmer has an office full of files. So I think in terms of trying to simplify those processes, but it's not so much, it's more the paperwork and the procedures rather than the end results. And I think CAP, certainly if CAP could have been tweaked more so that we were only using, without getting too technical, on Pillar 2, which tends to be the environmental improvement side of things, we were only designating 12.5% of the payments towards that. We could have gone up to 15%. I'd have liked to have seen a bigger chunk of that.
Kate Parmenter, anything you would get rid of?
Well, as I said, I think there's some legislation which could do with improving, but I don't think we should just focus on regulations. One of the things that we need to make sure of is that the government has more clear targets, because what we've seen with climate change, where obviously there has been a strong driver in Europe, but in the UK we've got our own Climate Change Act, which is now driving our agenda, and because we've just agreed the 5th carbon budget, in effect we've got our own trajectory of progress on that. And so what I would like to see is the government committing now, when it's talking about a new agricultural strategy, is actually saying we are going to have targets for biodiversity, we are going to have targets for improving water, we are going to have targets for air quality, which then shapes the emerging regulations at the lower level, because that's where this government has been less than clear in the past.
What would you'd get shot of the lot, wouldn't you, Stuart?
Not necessarily, actually. As I keep saying, that the EU has produced some good ideas, and there's no two ways around that. But we need to tweak these things. But there are certain ways they go about things that I really don't like. And one is this knee-jerk reaction to a pesticide. The neonicotinoid was a case in point. There were no field trials done in this country about this. I did write to George, when we had 4 counties who were allowed to use them, Suffolk, Bedfordshire, Herts and Cambs, that maybe we could study bee life in those 4 counties vis-a-vis Norfolk and Essex and Buckinghamshire around the outside, but he turned me down. That would have been an excellent example, a test. It would have been over such a big area.
Why did you turn him down? Here's a guy who wants to find out what the truth is, and you're a minister and you turn him down?
Well, there's two. Actually, I think they did do some exactly that sort of work, actually, as part of the stewardship agreement to look at the impact. So some of that work was done. But the truth is you need scientifically robust studies on this area. And that's why the very large study being done by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology is the right way forward, in my view.
So if you're going to keep it, hold on. If you're going to keep it, is there anything that you would keep, is what you're being asked, of what exists at the moment? If I'm right, what you're saying is you keep quite a lot of it, you just have more control in Parliament, is that right?
Quite a lot of it. I think my point would be this. I would change, I think, the emphasis away from, my view is that in latter years, particularly the last 5 years, there's been probably an over-emphasis from the European Commission on spatial designations, particularly when you're talking about the marine environment and you've got mobile species. There's an obsession with drawing lines on maps and not enough thought given to management techniques. And I'll give you an example. We're having to designate at the moment huge areas to supposedly protect harbour porpoise, but it's such a vast area that it doesn't mean very much. And if you were serious about protecting harbour porpoise, you would probably say, well, why don't we look at whether we could introduce technical measures such as pingers on drift nets to try to reduce bycatch. And that would be much simpler, much quicker, much easier. Those
who are not acquainted with pingers on... Would it drive them away, basically?
That's right. A pinger is rather... And it's a complex area because if... some of the concerns of pingers is it acts as what they call a dinner bell, where the seals get used to, and the cetaceans get used to the fact that they can go there and have free fish, and it has the opposite effect to what you want. But there are, this pinger technologies come on. to the extent that you could probably now work out some technical measures within fisheries regulations that would reduce bycatch.
It's obviously a really serious issue, this, but you have to say the idea of the competition between the seals and the other to avoid of the pinger, is it a pull or is it a push?
Absolutely, you've got to get the pinger with the right side.
I see a whole statement in the House of Commons coming up
exactly.
on it.
But I guess I'm coming back to the general point is, I think that there's been too much emphasis on spatial designation, which quite often hasn't meant very much, but takes a huge amount of lawyers' time and drafting time.
As opposed to what designation?
As opposed to actually just focusing on management measures that would deliver it. And we've got the power to put in place bylaws where we need it. So rather than necessarily designated an area to say this is a feeding ground for terns, for instance, it might be that if you're concerned about that feeding ground for terns, why not just put in place a bylaw that prevents the use of drift nets or gill nets? So that's the kind of thing we could do anyway without having to designate areas at great expense.
Martin Nesbitt.
Yeah,
what would you keep if you would? What would you lose?
I would be very enthusiastic about the prospects for designing a better agricultural policy than the one we have at present, and as Kerry says, one which is less focused on bureaucracy and auditing and much more focused on genuine outcomes. So that's an area where the EU has not been successful and where we could improve. But I think one of the concerns I have about I think George is right that sometimes there is a lot of process and detailed requirements in the European legislation, but it's often you can improve it to some extent, but often the process and the detailed requirements are what ensures that governments stick to what they say they're going to do. Otherwise, you're at risk of ministers and civil servants saying in an entirely well-meaning way, our objectives are X, Y, and Z, and doing some nice things which move vaguely in that direction, but without having a legal requirement to secure.
And then the Treasury or other departments could say, sorry, not on.
So there's nothing stopping. I mean, I assume there's no European legislation which is stopping the the pingers possibility at present. There's nothing stopping the UK from doing that. The question is whether there will be sufficient political will to ensure that we have the means to deliver the objectives that ministers commit to.
Natalie Bennett.
Well, I think I could come up with a huge long list, but I've come up with 3 very quickly. And the thing is, all of these things could have been done as a member of the EU, but the previous government promised to make huge reservations of marine reserves, no-catch reserves. It didn't deliver. This new government needs to deliver on those. Common agricultural policy, I think we can almost find agreement on reforms, but I suspect we might get different when we get to what reforms they are. Because I don't think the Duke of Westminster really needs agricultural subsidies. I want to put
Don't go there for a second, because we might be going there. Just hold off on it for a second on that particular thing.
We'll put a cap and really encourage small-scale agriculture. We've had a government policy that's refused to recognise even that 25 acres can be a farm, and it can be a very good and effective and environmental-friendly farm. And thirdly, getting away from perhaps the wildlife side of things, but let's treat housing as part of our national infrastructure. Let's insulate our homes. Let's cut our carbon emissions and tackle fuel poverty and create jobs at the same time.
I cut you off in your prime. Last quick thought.
Yes. Sure. One of the advantages of leaving the European Union is we won't be tied into TTIP arrangements or Mercosur arrangements where we have very little leverage or say in exactly what's happening. So that will be what you could call a good thing. But there's an Achilles heel in agriculture, and that is our enormous dependence on imported protein, soybeans or soybean meal. We import, I think, about 2.5 million tonnes a year, and everything you eat that comes from livestock, be it meat, milk, eggs, etc., is effectively from imported protein. I would like to see us, from the point of view of food security, really try and grow our own protein, and that would mean, yes, using new plant breeding methods, either to up our own peas and beans into a higher protein content, or to adapt soybeans more to our climate. We are running a real risk here in importing or having to import all this protein.
Just on the TTIP thing, you say we wouldn't be subject to the European negotiations, the United States, the TTIP negotiations, but you will recall that during the campaign, for better for worse, the American president was over here and said, okay, you don't do TTIP, you're at the back of the queue for any deal.
Well, he was obviously given that script because Americans don't talk about queues, they talk about lines. But
he was in England, he was being sensitive.
Yeah, he was given the script, we all know that. They've already said that they want to trade with us. And after all, the US is the biggest, largest single investor in the UK, and the UK is the biggest, largest single investor in the US. That is a fact. We will trade with them, but we can do it under our own terms and not what Mrs. Celia Malmstrom tells us we have to do.
Right. I'm going to bring it, yeah, they're coming on, the guy down here.
Thanks. Kate pointed out that when the UK is on good form, the EU doesn't stop us doing good things, but it magnifies the influence we have around the world. And Kerry pointed out that when the UK is on bad form, the EU locks us in with legal restraints from doing worse. So my question for the panel is, now that we're on our own, how is the UK going to exert its influence around the world to use our influence for better environmentalism? And when we're on bad form, what's going to stop us from taking away the targets and good things we have in place?
There's an embedded assumption that there is such a thing as bad form, which some people think there isn't. But can I leave that hanging and hold it in mind? It's a really beautifully put and important question, but I think we can come back to it more generally in time, the better for worse. Is there any other point before I go on? Yes, down here.
It's about sort of renewable energy. The renewable energy industry has been going through a torrid time under the current government, and I just wanted to see what opportunities the panel see in a post-EU world, both for sort of creating more opportunities within the UK and also an export market to go out to the rest of the world.
In general?
Yeah, in general.
What's your own, quite interesting, have a comment. What is your own hope or fear? You're not just or is that an open-ended question?
My hope is that the renewable energy industry grows under a post-EU world, but I find it very difficult to see a route to that happening without EU legislation.
Okay, I'm going to bring in our next question, but I'm going to put these together, but I'll ask both questioners if they would to put the question. It's Baroness Young and Tristan Pett. Baroness Young, where are you? I can see you somewhere, no? Yes, there she is. Janet.
Thank you. I know I'm only supposed to ask the question, but I've got to get a plug-in for Environmentalists for Europe, which I co-chair. I want to ask the panel what we've learnt from the Common Agricultural Policy, because we've learnt lots, and what next for a really green agriculture policy.
What have we learnt from the CAP, and what next for a really green agriculture policy? And related to that, Tristan Pett, would you put your question? Up at the back.
Now that we have the chance to change it, what would you like a reformed farm subsidies policy to look like?
Now that we can change it, what would you like a reformed farm subsidies policy to look like? So you've got the two together, because they do. How do you get a really green agricultural policy? Asked Janet Young, Tristan Pett. How would you like to see a reformed farm policy? Come to the farmer first. Stuart Agnew.
Well, you might be surprised to hear that I think that the concept of the single farm payment isn't a bad one for the following reason. That agriculture now is supported by the taxpayer as opposed to being supported by the consumer, as it was up until 1991 with all the intervention and the piles of butter and all the rest of it. Because if it's supported by the taxpayer, all taxpayers are consumers, but not all consumers are taxpayers. And so the other effect of handing a farmer a lump of money every year is that he can actually take a little bit less for his produce. So it does, in theory, tend to keep the price of food down. So I think that isn't a bad model, and the WTO, crucially, are happy with it. I would agree with Natalie that there should be a cap. I don't think it really is reasonable for somebody on 20,000 or less a year to hand enormous sums of money to somebody who owns land just because he owns land. So we are in absolute agreement on that.
Can I just say, an impertinent question, are you a beneficiary in those terms?
Yes, I am a beneficiary. I claim on about 400 acres, something like that. So I am a beneficiary, but of course my rent is assessed on the fact that I am claiming this, so inevitably this rolls up to the landlord. And this is the huge problem. Ultimately, it always does, and it's very hard to stop that. If it's capped, theoretically you could say, well, if a farmer with 2,500 say, goes, oh, I can't possibly manage without a subsidy on every acre, you can say to him, right, split it. Split it. Say to your sons, one day, you've been saying to them, one day, son, all this will be yours. Well, it is now, because you, on the reduced bit, will be able to claim the subsidy. It also might bring some new entrants in. So that's my take on that.
Could I just put in a plea for daughters as well?
All right, daughters. I accept.
Perhaps you could answer this question, but in part of it, Kate, saying what is this is Janet Young's question, for a really green agriculture policy? How would you define a really green agriculture policy, and is a really green policy desirable?
Well, as Martin has said, there are real opportunities because the CAP has historically been a policy which was about producing food and feeding us, which of course is important. But as we move into understanding more the role of land in delivering ecosystem services and protecting our biodiversity and our wildlife, we need to have a new policy which is not a policy about producing food, so not a common agricultural policy, but a common landscape policy. And we need a debate about what is it that we want our land to do, what do we as a country want it to, functions that we want to perform, and therefore what are the subsidies that we are prepared to pay.
And what do you want to do, and what do you think subsidies should be for?
Well, as I said earlier, I think we need clear targets set at the national level in terms of protecting our biodiversity, protecting our air quality and our water, all of those things which farmers help us do. Delivering on ecosystem services like protecting on flooding, and George rightly mentioned the Exmoor Bogs initiative is great, but how much better if farmers were being paid to support that? So we on the Lib Dems believe at this stage that we should be keeping the level of subsidies, but there should be very clear environmental benefits as well as producing food. So you have a subsidy system which is about delivering public benefits for delivering food and environmental or ecosystem services.
Do you not... You suggest that there's not a significant tension there. There is a huge tension there, surely.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, the present government, up until now, has completely divorced the issue of food and farming from biodiversity. We've had two separate strategies. I mean, I hear that the biodiversity one now is on the slow burner for understandable reasons. But you can't go ahead with having one strategy on food and farming and one on biodiversity. And I would challenge George directly. We're not going to be able to get answers tonight about the level of subsidy, but can he confirm that this government is going to have a policy which is about bringing together the needs for producing food and protecting our environment?
There you are, George.
Well, of course, but coming back to the original question.
Come back to the question in a second. Let's answer that point.
Yeah, of course, we'll have an agriculture policy that is about helping farmers manage risk on the one hand and protecting the environment on the other. There was always going to be an overlap between the two reports. We were explicit about that all the way. So it's always been a bit of a sort of false concern, this idea that we've got two strategies, so therefore you probably don't have a strategy on the environment. I don't accept it.
Is the strategy on the environment, in your mind, to your satisfaction, embedded in the food and farming?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it will be, and you know, people will see that when
it
will be when it's published.
Will be.
Yes, it's not published yet.
Right.
We're working on it, and obviously we'll be working on it now in the light of this decision. But on the original question was, what have we learnt from CAP? And I think what we've learnt actually that it is incredibly difficult to get a coherent policy when you've got 28 member states, each with different political makeups, each with totally different structures in their industry. And what we end up with, frankly, is a muddle. The fundamental truth is that a pan-European legal system that tries to codify and regulate every feature of our landscape, every hedge, every tree, simply does not work. It really is bonkers. I've dealt with this day in, day out for 2.5 years.
Give a specific example of what the bonkers characteristic is. If you can give a specific example of where bonkers is demonstrable.
Okay.
I mean, it's demonstrable generally in life.
I've given the cases several times. So I have to deal in my job with appeals of farmers who've maybe been late for their application. And early on, after getting this job, I had an appeal from a farmer who had missed the deadline by a few days. For this reason, his wife had always done the paperwork on the farm. She had sadly died of cancer that year. And so he had missed the deadline with everything going on in his life. At every stage of the appeal, all these people said the same thing, that they had huge sympathy for this farmer, but due to strict EU law, he could not be paid. So I sent this back and said, show some compassion. He's lost his wife, pay him. It's only a few days late. After all, deadlines are arbitrary, and I spent the next 6 months arguing with lawyers about whether this could be done without opening us up to £20 million of infraction fines or disallowance penalties from the EU. Now, this has been my life for 2.5 years, day in, day out, arguing over really stupid, simple things that ought to be quite straightforward to do. But because of the legal jeopardy created by an EU legal system, it isn't simple to do. And if we left, coming back, what we could do is remove all of that legal jeopardy, go back to first principles. And I'd like to unbundle the objectives of an agriculture policy so that one of them is, yes, to protect food security and promote farm profitability, so grants to help knowledge transfer, risk management tools to help farmers in bad times when things go wrong, as they always do in agriculture, and then a system of support for ecosystem services. So let's not call it a subsidy. Let's actually reward farmers for the work they do for our environment. And I also think there's a great deal of sense in structuring this on catchment, water catchment areas. That's one of the things we're looking at. So you really join up soil management, water management, habitat management in a coherent way, not what we have at the moment, which is a complete muddle.
Martin, pick up on the specific example briefly, if you would, before elaborating your more general response. The specific example of this very obviously sad, dreadful case of the farmer whose wife had just died, and the extent to which the law and the risk of huge fines, allegedly, prevents the payment of which in common justice, I imagine a lot of people would think should be paid.
Yeah. One of the issues with the CAP has been that the Commission is subject to criticism from the European Parliament and from the European Court of Auditors for its management of the CAP. The Commission gets extremely risk-averse about what it can permit. That then drives down to member states, which become very risk-averse in the way that they implement the CAP, and it comes down ultimately to a burden of bureaucracy on individual farmers. So I have a lot of sympathy with George on that.
More generally, on the green agriculture and/or how the change of the policy of the subsidies should be organised.
Well, I'm going to agree with Stuart, which is that one of the impacts of the current subsidy system is that rents and land prices are driven up. A lot of it is just lost in the additional wealth of landowners, which is probably a good thing for the landowners, but it's very difficult to see why there's a public goods case for that expenditure. So I think we do, as George says, need to get away from the idea of subsidy. We need to think about payments for specific services. Mostly those will be environmental services. There's also, I'd say, a case for subsidising the investment the industry makes in improving its own competitiveness, but we need to make sure that we're not exaggerating that subsidy in comparison with other sectors, which are also subject to international competition. And the third element, I would say, is that we need to ensure that those areas of agricultural land where there is high nature value and where it is very difficult to farm that land appropriately and make a profit from your production, in those cases we might want to think about an element of subsidy just for being a farmer and active in that area.
It's very interesting what you're saying, because you voted Remain, and therefore we would have continued to be subject to an evolving CAP policy. Do you think, looking at it from your detached perspective, that given the competing views there are about CAP, with the French being largely small farmers, absolutely committed to it and so on, well, pretty committed. Do you think it would be, let us assume for the purposes of argument, that whatever deal we come up with, there will be some kind of version of CAP because of trading in and trading back and having to meet the standards of European standards if we want to sell into Europe, etc. Do you think it is reformable, the CAP, within the EU?
Yeah, I used to say that the CAP's history had been a steady process of improvement over the decades, going from something which was actively harmful to something which is now just by and large a waste of money. So the movement has been in the right direction, but we haven't got towards actually investing the money properly. I'd say that we were talking earlier about the UK's record in influencing European policy in the right direction. The CAP is certainly much more environmentally focused and much more targeted on public interest issues now than it would have been if the UK had not been present in those negotiations and arguing the case. What I worry about is that without the UK as the kind of kernel of a small group of member states arguing for an improved, more rational CAP, the EU 27 will now drift back towards production subsidies and towards more harmful approaches. And that does have an impact on the decisions that we make within the UK, because the NFU and other lobbyists will be saying, but they're getting lots of money for that. Why aren't we getting that? And that is always a pressure on government. So, I think there is a lot of potential for designing a much better policy, but there are a lot of political risks for ministers and government in doing that.
Karen McCarthy.
I agree with what Kate said about looking at land management for everything from rewilding certain areas where it may not be particularly economical to grow food. I think flooding is a really interesting example of what we could do, in that you could pay farmers to allow their land to flood and therefore avoid the knock-on consequences on local communities, far more expensive flood defences. I think we could use it for that. The problem is, I think the underlying problem is about the economic viability of the farming in this country. So about 55% of farmers' incomes come from subsidies. And while I'm not, and it does need to be subsidised, but I think perhaps sometimes the subsidies sort of mask the fact that there are market failures. So, for example, a milk farmer will tell you it costs about 28p a litre to produce milk, and at the moment, Arla, one of the big distributors, are paying them about 19p. So they're losing money, and I've met with pig farmers that are losing money, potato farmers that are losing huge amounts of money. And I think it does come a point when you just can't keep saying, well, we're going to carry on subsidising that, because what also happens is that the response to not being able to make money tends to be increasing production, so therefore you've got even more.
So how do you, given that description, certainly in the case of dairy farmers, we know that they're going out of business at a tremendous rate weekly, and with an extraordinary impact on local communities as well, because of the role of the family farm, the smaller farm, etc. What do you do about this, quote, market failure that you described?
I mean, certainly, in terms of, there's two ways to try and make money. One is to go for massive quantities, so the intensive industrial model. So I went to a chicken farm where it's over 1 million chickens a year, and they're making 2p per chicken. It's high welfare things, but the profit on a chicken is 2p. And you get to the point where you think, is it worth the effort? But that's one way of trying to make money. The other way is to go into the sort of value-added premium produce, which is not easy for a pint of milk. You can make money if you've got an organic herd, but you can do it, say, with yogurts and cheese, and it's whether we should be looking at trying to encourage that end of the market as opposed to just sheer quantity.
Forgive me, personally, for a moment, I speak as a former president of the Soil Association and an organic farmer. Truth is, it is a tiny proportion of the market. If you're dealing with 97% of food consumption in this country, or a figure approximating to that, you say that farmers are driven out of business. You say that large farmers producing potatoes are out of business. You say that dairy farmers all sides are also threatened. What is the solution? You're suggesting subsidies aren't the solution. Now you're free, right? Okay, allegedly free. You're outside the EU. What do you do to make sure that farming functions effectively and efficiently and doesn't put the cost of food up sky high for ordinary consumers?
Well, that's why I'm saying I was Shadow DEFRA Secretary for 9 or 10 months and had so many conversations with people about this, but I don't think anyone had the answer. So you would turn to the NFU and say, tell me what you think the solution is to the crisis in the dairy industry. Let's ask the minister who's got some responsibilities. How do you answer the question I just put to Kerry?
Well, this is where, as I said, for me, one of the objectives of a coherent agriculture policy should be risk management. And there's a number of ways you could do this. I mean, Australia have a system where in good years, farmers can pay money tax-free into a kind of reserve fund that they then access when things go wrong. You've got the Canadian model where they have government-backed insurance schemes so that if there is a terrible crop failure or a collapse in commodity prices, the insurance scheme pays out to support farm incomes and stop them losing huge amounts of money. And you can have things like futures markets, which we've been exploring to try to help iron out the peaks and troughs of dairy prices, which is a particular challenge in that industry because it's hard to turn production on and off. So that's why, to me, risk management is a crucial part of a coherent agricultural policy, and there's a better way to do it than just having a single farm payment for everyone.
Let me go to some thoughts on this first of all. There was a hand down here, and then the woman who's near the pillar at the back. So there was a hand up right about 4 rows back in front. Yes, just here. The woman just here, about 5 rows back. And then to you, ma'am. Yes, in green, I think, unless my colour scheme is wrong.
Hi, my question is specifically for George. You talked about commodity futures. Given that Britain's one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in Europe, what do you think is the future of cap and trade in Britain? And what do you think the impact of it is on the EU ETS scheme?
The last bit, what do you think, that before you said the impact on the, what is the impact, can you repeat that last
Of
part?
Brexit
The acoustics here are always interesting.
What's the impact of Brexit in terms of Britain's future in the cap and trade scheme?
Right.
A cap and trade scheme. That is a sort of deck issue. I'm afraid I'm not an expert on it, but I would say this.
You are working in silos.
I know.
Where's the joined-up government that we always heard?
I know how Andrew Letty was in that, who's joining, obviously, DEFRA. But, the answer is, and I know on those emissions trading schemes, there had been concern that actually the price had been set at such a level that it wasn't really biting and having an impact anyway. So the emissions trading schemes had got discredited. But look, we will still, we took part in COP21 where we discussed climate change. We'll still be participating in all those international climate change.
Hold off on that, you've got a question coming up on that.
Okay.
Yes, you, ma'am.
Yes, I was just wondering, drawing out on the points that you were making earlier, whether Brexit could have a positive or negative effect on farm animal welfare in this country.
Brexit, an impact on farm animal welfare. Let's start with you, Stuart.
This is one of the problems now with an expanding European Union, is that there are different attitudes and different cultures as regards animal welfare. And for many people in Eastern Europe, were treated extremely badly under the Soviet regime, and animal welfare was really well down the agenda. So the European Union has produced a lot of legislation on animal welfare, but it's the enforcement that is lacking. This is the problem. That if you have an attitude in a country that such and such an activity isn't particularly cruel, there's no real oomph to want to enforce it, because it's not something they would have done themselves. And I think, is a problem.
This is an example, therefore, of the European Union not forcing countries to do things they don't want to do, but failing to get countries to do what they ought to do. Which suggests it isn't quite as all-powerful as you were suggesting.
The enforcement is poor, because they hollow out the institutions of the member states to do the enforcement for them.
Do you think, if you care, as I'm sure you do, about animal welfare, that outside we will be in a better position to persuade other European countries that they should raise animal welfare standards to those that we expect here?
Well, they have raised the standards, as I said before, but they're not necessarily enforced. I'm quite convinced there are still battery cages in Romania. I don't know where they got the money from to change from battery cages to colonies, and I haven't been able to find any supplier who actually supplied them with the equipment. So I think they are still there. And if I was a Romanian Minister of Agriculture, I would think to myself, if I force my egg producers to go to colonies at a cost of 20 quid a bird, they wouldn't be able to do it, and lo and behold, Ukrainian eggs from battery cages will come into Romania. So there is no incentive for them at all to enforce the rules.
Yeah, Martin.
This is we tend to focus on those areas of legislation which feel as if they've been in some way imposed on the UK from outside, and forget those areas where the UK has been enormously successful in ensuring that our priorities are recognised and adopted across the EU based on a democratic process with majority voting and the approval of the European Parliament. So we now have animal welfare standards which are much higher in Eastern Europe than they would otherwise be, and than they would be if the UK were not participating
is Stuart right, just on the minor points, where is Stuart right, however, that there is a lot of backsliding in some European countries?
In much the same way that the UK is not always excellent at implementing European legislation that it doesn't particularly like, other member states are also sometimes slow in implementing that legislation, but it will get there. And the Commission has certainly been taking enforcement action against some of the Eastern European member states on animal welfare standards.
George, then Kerry.
I just wanted to move it beyond the issue of regulation. One of the things that I've mooted that we could explore is actually having systems where you reward farmers who go above and beyond the regulatory base on animal welfare. And I've had discussions with Compassion in World Farming and with the RSPCA on this, where you could, for instance, just as we do on organics, rather than somebody who has sort of outdoor bred pigs and finishes them in barns with straw, rather than just say, well, you've got to earn the premium only in the market, you could have a system where you try and reward that and incentivize that through payments. And the RSPCA have actually worked up some quite interesting proposals where you could have tiered approaches for different levels of animal welfare. So I think it's another opportunity that we could look at in this. And of course, the other final thing is we will rejoin OIE in our own right.
OIE?
It's the International Organization for Animal Welfare. And our veterinary experts will now take a seat there, will vote there, and we will provide our own veterinary expertise to countries, developing countries, who often want to improve their animal welfare but don't yet have the expertise in place or the systems in place to do it. So we'll really be able to, I think, help the rest of the world raise its standards through OIE by regaining our seat.
Kerry?
Well, Martin was entirely right that in some areas we've really led the way. So things like battery cages, sow stalls, veal crates, and that was why I thought it was so important to be part of the European Union, because we could encourage other countries to do that. You've got 500 million consumers that are, it's not ideal. The Eastern European countries will take longer to come on board, but at least they're being pulled in that direction. And the concern is now that if we walk away, if we're part of the single market, we may well have to meet the same standards anyway in terms of being able to trade, but we lose our influence in terms of being in the discussions. So you could have a situation where if we want to maintain the standards we've got, the rest of the EU could be backsliding without our influence. But the other thing I just want to say, TTIP was mentioned earlier, and there is real concern, yes, about the impact that TTIP would, if we joined up to TTIP, that would have on things like animal welfare and food safety standards, because America, for example, allows hormone-pumped meat, chicken washed in chlorine, all sorts of things that we don't allow within the EU. Now, you can say, well, it's great, we're not part of the EU, we're not signing up to TTIP, but actually a bilateral trade treaty with the US, we'd be far more likely to sign up to that sort of thing than if we had the bargaining power of all the other European countries fighting against it as well.
Why would we be far more likely to sign up?
Well, because we're in a weaker bargaining position. If you've got 28 European countries, you're a big trading bloc, and the US would really want to do that deal, you can say to them, we're going to set certain priorities, we're not going to allow your meat into the EU. If it's just the UK, and as we said, we're at the back of the queue, there is, and it depends who's in government, obviously, but there is a danger, I think, that we will just roll over and say, we want this so much that we'll take whatever you give.
Natalie Bennett, then George.
Just to follow on from Kerry on that, I was actually, when we were discussing whether we were going to leave or remain, conjuring up a nightmare, and I apologise in advance for anyone who I give nightmares to tonight, but my nightmare then was that we'd voted for leave and Prime Minister Boris Johnson went to Washington and on bended knee begged President Trump for a free trade deal. I didn't get the nightmare quite right, but it's looking awfully close, isn't it? And the fact is, TTIP is dead. The German late equivalent of the Labour Party has said they're not going to back it. Hollande has come out against it. TTIP is dead. We're now left with our nightmare of bilateral agreement. But I also want to come back very much to the point about the question we started. I haven't had a chance to talk about what we can learn from CAP and what we need to change. And one key thing that we need to change, and it ties in with a lot of our discussion here, is what we need to do is end factory farming. Now, when Stuart started talking about
sorry
the problem...
to interrupt you again. Well, I'm not really sorry. Define, for the purpose of this argument, what factory farming is.
Okay, intensive feeding of animals using shipped-in produce on a large scale, very intensively.
Okay.
Now, I did think when Stuart started talking about imported protein like soya from the Amazon, I thought there was a risk that we might be going to agree on two things. But of course he went on then to say that he wants to grow the protein here to feed our animals in these intensive farming systems. The reality is that we cannot afford the impact of these. And I think Kerry was talking about the huge scale poultry with a profit of 2p per bird. Of course we're all paying enormously for the environmental impacts, the social impacts, the human impacts of that form of farming. So the cost is actually being borne by all of us.
Briefly, because I must move on, because we're moving towards our end. Stuart and then Minister.
Just talking about animal welfare in Europe, most of you will be horrified to know that if you're taxpayers, you are subsidising bullfighting in Spain. Yes, you are. So at least leaving the European Union will mean less money for that. Then I just want to quickly talk about how to increase the animal welfare standards here. I don't think you do it through legislation. You do it through the supermarkets. You get them to buy into schemes. a scheme where a minimum standard is this and this and this and this, which is what I do on my free-range egg unit. They then will not import because they have committed themselves to buying to a certain standard. And I think that's a much better way to approach it. Talking of free-range eggs, what about free-range milk? We built a free-range egg industry in this country because consumers didn't like the idea of birds in battery cages. I get the drift that consumers don't like the idea of 8,000 cow dairy herds. Would they be prepared to pay more from milk from cows, herds of about 70 cows? Consumers' choice. And finally, define it, please, Natalie. I've got 35,000 free-range chickens. At what point, if I keep adding on another one all the time, will you suddenly turn around to me and say, you are an intensive factory farmer, or the other way around, you may call me one now. How many birds have I got to drop before you say, oh, you're a lovely twee family farmer, Stuart? Give me the number.
I'm going to leave that. You don't have to give the number because it's a rhetorical question.
My non-rhetorical answer is you are a factory farmer.
Right. Or, as I used to say when I had a role in this, instead of kind of doing half-heartedly, farm your chickens in an organic way, which has strict numbers, maximum numbers, both if you're producing eggs, and in terms of lifespan, if you're producing meat, the chicken has to live for 72 days, rather than, if the figures haven't changed, I'm out of date doubtless, rather than 33 days, which is often the market driver now. Minister, more broadly, and in summary before I move on.
Just very briefly, this country's got a very good track record of arguing for high animal welfare standards as part of trade negotiations. We've got it as a manifesto commitment. And in fact, among the European countries, we're the ones that tend to push that hardest. Some of the other countries have got other issues, such as geographic indicators and other concerns they've got. We're the ones that tend to focus on making sure that there's equity when it comes to treatment of animal welfare. And we've got a good track record, and I think we should have a bit more confidence and faith in ourselves to get these things right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've slightly glossed over the fact that, 60% of our exports, and even more for our livestock farmers, are in Europe. So if we don't enter into some form of either an EFTA or an EEA arrangement, then farmers are going to be facing real financial difficulties, which will undoubtedly have an impact on animal welfare, because one of the reasons that, yes, there are some farmers who are very good, but one of the reasons why we've been able to persuade others, kicking and screaming into higher standards, as Kerry said, for veal, for battery eggs, and for dairy standards, is because they know they've got to meet those standards in the market that they're selling them in. So I think there are some very real concerns.
And I'm now going to press to our next, and will probably be our last question, from Ian Bailey. Ian. Microphone for him. Thank you.
Thank you. Something of a restatement of the question just to my right a few moments ago, but what are the implications of the UK's withdrawal from the EU for cooperation on climate policy, both in respect to the commitments made under the Paris Agreement and EU-led policies to achieve those targets?
Natalie Bennett.
Well, what you're making me think of is I was actually up in Manchester with a speaker from the Tyndale Centre on Climate Change, and what she was making was the point, this was during the referendum debate, was that actually how the EU had got together and had been agreeing targets on things like renewable energy, things like targets for energy efficiency, was a great model of how we needed to work around the world under the Paris climate talks. So unfortunately, what we've done simply on that basis, ignoring any other issue, is we've stepped backwards. We've stepped away from that cooperation. So what we've got to do is keep that cooperation up. I mean, I agree with others here who think that we should remain part of the single market. And I believe we need the rules of the single market, and that would keep a lot of the targets in there.
Natalie, do you believe that it is possible, if the government wills it, to live with the climate treaty, the Paris Treaty, everyone regards as extremely important, and the policies introduced to achieve the 2030 goals, that is perfectly possible? It's a matter of will, or is it dependent upon being inside the EU and therefore we're going to lose it?
No, it is a matter of will. We need to find a government with the will, however.
Stuart, I may be misquoting you. At the very beginning of this, you were slightly sort of, how could I put it, a climate change sceptic.
Man-made climate change sceptic. Chairman, please say that. The climate will change. It has always changed. And in my view, we are not going to alter that. It was warm In the Roman periods, we grew grapes near Hadrian's Wall. We had a medieval warm period. Where was all the CO2 and the combustion engines then? It got warmer more recently. We need to understand that our climate is driven by solar cycles, lunar cycles, jet streams and ocean currents. They are the main drivers. The CO2 and the greenhouse gases are very, very minor. So the war on CO2 is pointless. CO2 is crucial to me as a farmer. It is totally irreplaceable as a plant food. Totally irreplaceable. The more you give, the more CO2 you give a plant, the faster it will grow. Furthermore, in a rich CO2 environment, it will be more drought resistant. This is quite scientifically tabulated, except to say it is a heresy. See, listen to them. Listen to them. There will be a Kincanute moment, thank God. We look at one another and say, what are we doing? Let's just adapt to what God has given us in terms of climate. But, having said all that, the one thing we can do is improve air quality, and in my lifetime, I have seen London, no more smog there. We can do that.
Do you dissent, Kate Parmenter, in any way from what you've just heard?
Well, let's just say we have a very large difference of opinion on this matter. I mean, we are fortunate that we have the Climate Change Act, and therefore, although we are, if we leave Europe, we are moving outside the Paris Agreement. We do have our Climate Change Act, which has got the carbon budgets which have been agreed. But as Natalie rightly said, you then need the political will to deliver on those. Just one concrete example, in the last 6 months, we had a housing and planning bill where we gave the government the opportunity, and Barbara and I and others in the House of Lords moved an amendment which would ensure that all future housing was built to zero carbon standards. If we're going to tackle climate change seriously in the future, doing it by tackling our heating and our housing and energy efficiency is the most cheapest way to do it. This government, George's government, we got it through the House of Lords twice. On every occasion, they said, no, that's red tape. That is red tape on housing developers. So if they're not prepared to make decisions like that, then now, I do not have the confidence that this government has the political will to deliver.
George.
I think on all of it links to a couple of the points.
First of all, I take you not quite as...
I'm not going with Stuart on this particular one, because I think the fact that carbon dioxide it has an insulating effect and causes rises in temperature is a scientific fact. But no, I don't want to go there. But the point I want to... Okay, sorry, Stuart.
Hang on, George. You're a politician. You clearly want to go there again and again.
Well, exactly.
Look what happens. First bit of applause you got.
Exactly. It's clearly a contentious issue. The point I wanted to make, there's a wide, but I've dealt through DEFRA with a lot of the international wildlife conventions that we're involved with. And this idea that you gain influence around the world on these conventions by being in the EU is based on a total misconception. Because if, like me, you have to deal with the what they call the rules of procedure on how these things work, the truth is that on everything from the Convention on Migratory Species, the IWC dealing with whaling, CITES, all of these conventions, we have been systematically undermined by the EU in recent years, particularly since the Lisbon Treaty. And I'll give you just one example to point. In 2010, in the dying days of the last Labour government, when Hilary Benn was doing the job, there was a motion to try to curtail international sales in bluefin tuna, which is at risk. It's overfished in the Atlantic. And there was an attempt to get a compromise at European level, which we supported. That fell through. And the government of the day, a Labour government, decided to break with the EU position and to side with Monaco and the US and back a much more ambitious motion that would have banned the sale of bluefin tuna. And the extraordinary thing is that the European Commission started infraction proceedings against the UK for disobeying orders. Now, we've had this in many areas. If we do not, we have to clear everything we want to say and everything we want to vote on with the European Commission. And it's not on. And it affects our position on everything from protecting polar bears, where we were forced to abstain 3 years ago. It affects our stance on whaling, where we've been watered down because of the stance taken by countries like Denmark. If we leave the EU, and we're going to do it now, we're going to regain our seat on all of these. We'll be able to build international coalitions. We won't be hamstrung by a common EU position. Where we agree with other European countries, we'll be able to work with and cooperate with them. But crucially, we're going to regain our voice and our voting rights on these international conventions. And the world needs the UK on these conventions, in my view.
Kerry.
On that point, which I've heard George make before, we may regain independence and our voice, but it will be a weaker voice because we're not speaking with the strength of 28 countries going into those negotiations. And that's the same with the position that we took to COP21. The fact that the EU had its discussions and then took that forward, as well as, then it gave us a good position from which to try to bring other countries into the fold. It's interesting, if you look at some of the leading Brexiteers, how many of them are actually climate change deniers as well. And it's almost like, I think, a sort of psychological thing, that it's people that resist the need to do something about things. So it's this ideological resistance to what they would call regulation and red tape and interfering with the way the market works. It seems to then be sort of pushed over to interfering with the way the planet works and just letting things sort of develop in the way that Stuart was talking about. And it goes back to, I have a belief, and that's why I'm a Labour politician, that government does have a role, whether it's in regulating environmental protection or whether it's ameliorating the worst effects of climate change. It's an interventionist approach. And I think the people that deny climate change, it's partly because they've got this ideological thing that they don't want to do anything about it.
Kerry, you've played a slight political game there, haven't you? I mean, of the 17+ million who voted leave, we know that there are those who deny that, Stuart has said, deny that man or woman-made climate change exists. But you wouldn't go on and say that the great majority of that 17 million.
No, I said of the leading Brexiteers, you've got people like Owen Paterson, Nigel Lawson, quite a few of the UKIP people. It wasn't a factor in terms of the 17 million votes for Brexit. Most of them weren't thinking about the environment.
Well, didn't get much chance to debate the environment.
In answer to the earliest question, I think it was quite sad they weren't, but I don't think that was a factor for them.
Natalie and then Martin.
Well, I think that's a really important point, and of course I'd add to that list Boris Johnson, which is a bit of a worry. But I think the sorry, I've entirely forgotten where the question was. I got distracted.
You got this thing about Boris, as it were.
There's a reason for that, yeah.
The question is whether effectively will our meeting of targets, whether it's Paris, whether it's 2030, will that be negatively impacted, to use a horrible phrase, by Brexit?
Well, I think what we'll take away is the European rules. The Europeans signed up, so we won't be signed up to those. Of course, as Kate rightly said, we have the Climate Change Act. But of course, we had a former situation where it was being admitted in private, and the ecologists leaked the letter where the minister was saying, yes, we're not going to meet these legally binding targets, with a letter that only came out because it was leaked. And of course, we could have a risk where Parliament could remove that. So, the stronger, the tighter we work together, in terms of when we were campaigning on Europe, talking about how we have joint problems we need to face together. Climate change is the joint problem that needs to see people working together around Europe, around the world. And the more cooperation, the more interlinks, the more people are related together, tied together. We've talked a lot about, we have been a restraint on Poland within the EU in terms of climate policy. We need to work together. And, I really have to come back to Stuart on this. Ultimately, I don't think he should be talking about this because this isn't politics. This is physics. Climate change is it.
Final word to Martin.
Yeah, in terms of the question on implications for climate policy, and coming back to, I think it was Richard's question earlier about where the UK has been a force for good and where not. I mean, the UK has generally been a force for good in some aspects of climate policy within the EU. So we've been generally pushing for more ambition on overall targets for emissions reductions. We've been pushing for lower caps on the ETS and mechanisms to drive up the price within the ETS. But we've been to some extent a constraint on some of the practical action that would be needed to implement those targets. So, the UK, for example, has argued against member state targets for renewable energy, which, in my view, are essential to ensure that member states take early action and invest early in the decarbonisation of the energy supply that we know that we need. And the UK has also had a principal position of opposing taxation measures within the EU. So, possibly we will get more chances of action on carbon taxes at EU level, more prospects of a more effective mechanism for ensuring investment in renewable energy, but at the cost of less ambition on the overall emissions reduction targets and less ambition within the ETS. And just to come back to a question earlier, I think, about what are the implications for the ETS, I think this is one of those issues where early clarity from government on some of the uncertainties that are now created is necessary, because you have people who are holding allowances in what is essentially a mixed EU system, and we have no idea of what is going to happen to those allowances. They don't have a UK label to them, but they are set for a carbon market in which the UK is a significant part. We need early clarity on that, and the risk is that the Article 50 process doesn't give us enough time to provide that clarity.
There is common ground in that we live in absolute uncertainty about what happens, when it happens, what the medium long-term implications will be. Absolute agreement that the environment generally matters, and with the exception of the issue of climate change, where Stuart took a marginally different view, there was I thought it was slightly more nuanced analysis than I had actually expected from the panel, which was quite interesting. I hope you found it. I'm sorry we couldn't go to more questions. We do have to stop. I hope you found it useful and engaging to hear these variety of views on these very critical questions. So if you do think that, before the president of the RGS comes to say a few words, would you thank our panel here?
There can be no better chair for a subject of such significance than Jonathan Dimbleby. Thank you, Jonathan, very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for steering us through issues of, as you put it, seismic dimension. It's clear this evening that we face an opportunity to rethink, to redefine our relationship with our habitat. It's also clear that we're only just beginning that process. Events since the Conservative Manifesto pledge to call an in-out referendum before 2017 have taught us two things. Never has expertise been more important, and never has public engagement with politics and policy been more important. At the start of this evening, Ed Maltby, thank you, Ed, kindly thanked the RGS, IBG and the British Ecological Society for the partnership with the Sibthorpe Trust, which has led to tonight's event. I'd also like to take this opportunity now to thank our supporters, the Wellcome Trust and the Society for the Environment, who've generously provided additional sponsorship to make this evening happen. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'd like to thank you in the audience for your participation and your engagement. I'd now like to invite you to leave by one of those two doors and turn right and head for the map room, where you can exchange your token for a complimentary drink and continue with this momentous discussion. You're also welcome to view the Atkins Environmental Photographer of the Year exhibition in our pavilion. Thank you all very much for being here this evening, and thank you, Jonathan, and our panel of experts.